In episode 65, titled Discretization Choices, Binning for Interpretability and Model Stability, the focus is on using binning when simplicity and stability matter more than precision, because not every problem benefits from keeping continuous values in their most granular form. Continuous features can carry rich information, but they can also amplify noise, produce fragile thresholds, and create interpretations that are too technical for leaders who need clear policy guidance. The exam cares because binning is a practical trade-off tool. It can stabilize models, reduce sensitivity to outliers, and align analytics outputs with decision rules, but it can also degrade performance if done carelessly. In real systems, binning often becomes part of governance and communication because a small number of well-defined ranges can be easier to justify and maintain than a complex continuous function. The core idea is that binning is not a shortcut. It is a deliberate design choice that trades resolution for clarity and robustness. When you can explain that trade-off, you demonstrate both modeling judgment and operational awareness. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Binning is the process of converting continuous values into categorical ranges so that a numeric variable becomes a set of discrete buckets like low, medium, and high based on boundaries you define. The model or decision logic then operates on which bin a value falls into rather than on the exact raw number. This changes the type of information available because the exact differences within a bin are discarded, but it also reduces the influence of small fluctuations that may not matter operationally. Binning can also make relationships easier to capture for simple models because the model can treat each bin as a separate category with its own effect rather than trying to fit a continuous slope. The exam expects you to recognize that binning changes representation and therefore changes what the model can learn and how you interpret it. When you define binning clearly, you also set up the key question: how do you choose boundaries so the representation stays meaningful? Bins can be chosen in several ways, and the exam often tests whether you can match a binning strategy to the scenario's goals and constraints. Domain thresholds use subject matter cutoffs, such as policy limits, risk tier boundaries, or service level objectives, making bins aligned to real decision points rather than to the distribution alone. Quantile binning divides the data into bins with roughly equal counts, which can stabilize estimates by ensuring each bin has enough observations, even when the distribution is skewed. Equal width binning divides the range into equal numeric intervals, which is easy to define and explain, but can create sparse bins if the distribution is uneven. The right strategy depends on whether interpretability should follow business rules, whether you need statistical balance per bin, and whether the scale has meaningful linear intervals. When you explained bin selection, you show that bins are not arbitrary. They should reflect either domain meaning or statistical support. One reason binning can help is that it can reduce noise and make patterns clearer by smoothing away small, unimportant variation within ranges. If a continuous feature is measured with jitter or minor fluctuations that do not change risk meaningfully, a binned representation can prevent the model from chasing that noise. Binning can also reduce the impact of heavy tails by grouping extreme values into a top bin, limiting leverage without requiring complex transformations. In some cases, binning can reveal a threshold effect more cleanly because the relationship may be relatively flat within a region and then change sharply at a boundary that bins can encode explicitly. The exam expects you to recognize binning as a stability tool, particularly when the underlying relationship is not smoothly linear or when measurement precision exceeds decision precision. When you narrate this benefit, you are saying that the system cares about ranges, not exact decimals, so the model should reflect that reality. The danger is using too many bins, because that recreates sparsity and overfitting risk by turning one continuous variable into many categories with thin support per bucket. If you split a variable into many narrow bins, you create many parameters for a model to estimate, and each bin may have too few observations to produce a stable effect estimate. This is especially risky when the outcome is rare, because some bins may contain almost no positive cases, leading to noisy and misleading signals. Too many bins can also create brittle decision boundaries, where small measurement differences cause bin jumps that are not meaningful, increasing instability. The exam often tests this by presenting overly granular binning as an appealing way to capture detail, when the correct reasoning is that detail without support becomes noise. When you avoid too many bins, you are protecting generalization and keeping the representation aligned with the evidence available. Too few bins can be equally harmful because it hides useful variation and can flatten real risk gradients into a single broad category. If you collapse a variable into only 2 or 3 bins when the relationship changes meaningfully across the range, you may lose predictive power and create misleading interpretations. A single high bin that lumps moderate and extreme values together can obscure the difference between manageable risk and extreme risk, leading to decisions that are too blunt. Too few bins can also interfere with calibration because the model cannot assign different probabilities within a bin even if the true risk differs substantially across values. The exam expects you to recognize this trade-off and to choose bins that preserve important structure while still reducing noise. When you describe this risk, you are emphasizing that binning should simplify, not oversimplify, and that boundaries should reflect meaningful shifts in behavior or risk. Binning is often used to improve interpretability for leaders and policy rules because ranges map naturally to thresholds, categories, and operational playbooks. Leaders can act on statements like, "Above this latency threshold, user experience degrades sharply," or "Accounts in this spend tier receive this level of review." And those statements are easier to communicate than continuous slopes and subtle marginal effects. Bins also support policy design because they can define consistent treatment rules, such as escalation tiers, audit tiers, or service priorities. The exam frequently tests this by asking what representation supports explainable decision-making, and binning is often a correct answer when the objective includes governance and human interpretability. The key is that interpretability must be paired with validity. Bins should not be chosen purely to tell a convenient story. When you align bins with policy thresholds, you make the model's logic more transparent and operationally actionable. Monotonic binning is a special idea that can help when risk increases steadily with value, because it encourages a bin structure where higher bins correspond to higher risk in an orderly way. The goal is to avoid bin definitions that produce confusing reversals, such as a mid-range bin showing higher risk than the top bin, unless there is a compelling process reason for that pattern. Monotonic binning can be guided by domain expectation, such as higher latency generally implying worse experience, or higher exposure generally implying higher risk, and it can support stable interpretations. This is especially useful when you want bins that become a narrative, like risk tiers, rather than just a computational convenience. The exam may not use the phrase monotonic binning, but it will often imply a monotone relationship and ask for a representation that supports it. When you use monotonic binning thoughtfully, you are encoding an expected directional structure and reducing the chance of noisy bin-level reversals. Practice helps make these decisions concrete, and the exam often uses familiar variables like age, spend, latency, or credit-related metrics because they naturally invite binning discussions. Age often has meaningful cutoffs tied to policy, risk, or eligibility, but it can also be binned by quantiles to balance groups when policy thresholds are not the focus. Spend can be highly skewed, making quantile bins useful for ensuring enough support in each tier, while still allowing a top tier that captures heavy spenders. Latency often aligns to service levels, where domain thresholds like acceptable, degraded, and unacceptable map directly to operational actions. Credit-like metrics often come with established bands that organizations already understand, making domain thresholds the natural bin boundaries for interpretability. The exam expects you to choose bins that reflect either decision thresholds or statistical support, depending on what the scenario emphasizes. When you narrate these examples, you show that binning is about matching representation to real-world meaning and evidence. Binning should be validated based on performance and calibration, not just accuracy, because binning changes probability estimates and decision quality in ways that a single metric can hide. A binned model might have similar accuracy to a continuous model, but worse calibration, meaning it predicts probabilities that are systematically too high or too low within bins. Binning can also improve calibration if it reduces overfitting and stabilizes estimates, especially when continuous relationships are noisy. The exam expects you to consider calibration because binning often supports policy thresholds, and thresholds require well-calibrated probabilities or at least stable ranking across risk tiers. Validation should be done on held-out data using the same bin boundaries and should include stability checks across segments and time because bins can behave differently when distributions shift. When you validate binning properly, you treat it as a modeling intervention with measurable impact, not as a purely interpretive choice. Documentation of bin boundaries is essential because deployment logic must match training logic exactly, and any drift in boundaries changes the meaning of the bins. If a model was trained with a top bin defined as values above a threshold, and a later pipeline change shifts that threshold, the model will receive a different representation, and predictions will change even if the underlying data did not. Documentation should include boundary values, the rationale for choosing them, how missing values are handled, and how out-of-range values are treated. The exam treats this as part of reproducibility and governance because binning is effectively a set of rules, and rules must be stable and auditable. Documentation also helps when you revisit bins after drift because you can compare old and new distributions and decide whether boundaries still make sense. When you document bins, you make discretization a controlled part of the system, not an informal analyst habit. Drift is a real risk for binned variables because bin populations can shift over time, changing how many records fall into each bin and altering the model's effective input distribution. If a system improves and latency drops, bins that used to be populated may become rare, while bins that were rare may become common, changing the model's calibration and the meaning of risk tiers. If business behavior changes, spend distributions may shift, moving users across bins and changing how stable the bins are as segments. Drift can also break assumptions behind quantile bins because quantile boundaries are tied to a historical distribution and may no longer reflect balanced groups in the future. The exam expects you to recognize that binning is not a set-and-forget step, It requires monitoring of bin counts and performance over time to ensure the discretized representation remains valid. When you narrate drift here, you are emphasizing that bins are representations of a distribution, and distributions evolve. A helpful anchor memory is: bins trade precision for clarity. Choose boundaries carefully. Precision is the fine-grained numeric information you lose. Clarity is the interpretability and stability you gain. And boundaries are the decision points that determine whether the trade-off is beneficial. This anchor helps on the exam because it prevents two common mistakes, which are binning without purpose and binning without evidence. It also reinforces that binning is not inherently good or bad. It is good when the simplified representation matches decision needs and reduces noise, and it is bad when it throws away signal or creates sparse categories. When you apply the anchor, you naturally ask what clarity you need, what precision you can afford to lose, and what boundaries reflect real thresholds or stable support. That reasoning leads to binning choices that are defensible rather than arbitrary. To conclude episode 65, create 3 bins verbally and then state why they help, because that demonstrates both representation choice and justification. Suppose the variable is latency in milliseconds, and the decision goal is operational triage and reporting to leaders, so you choose 3 bins, such as acceptable, degraded, and unacceptable, based on service level expectations. Acceptable might represent values that meet the expected user experience. Degraded might represent values that are noticeable and likely to trigger complaints, and unacceptable might represent values that indicate a serious performance issue requiring immediate action. These bins help because they translate continuous variation into action-oriented tiers that align with how teams respond, reducing noise from minor fluctuations while still preserving meaningful shifts across thresholds. They also improve communication because leaders can understand and track how much traffic falls into each service tier without needing to interpret heavy-tailed distributions. This is the disciplined use of binning, a small set of well-chosen ranges that stabilize modeling and make results actionable without pretending that precision beyond decision needs is automatically valuable. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.